You'll birth me sons every year with that body, Virgin Mountain Man declared to obese Amish girl. In the dead of winter, a lonely mountain man storms into a dusty rail town. Laughter rises as an Amish girl is mocked, cast out by her own father. Then, his thunderous voice shakes the street. You'll birth me sons every year with that body. What begins as a scandalous declaration becomes something no one saw coming. In a cabin lit by lamplight, faith and tenderness stir where shame once lived. But when church elders and a ruthless railroad man come to tear them apart, the mountain shakes with storm and steel. She was meant to be forgotten. He was meant to be alone. Together they've lit a fire no one can quench. But when blood spills in the churchyard and she's dragged away into the night, will their love be strong enough to defy family, law, and the weight of a cruel world? Your comments remind me that we're not alone in feeling deeply. If loyalty, second chances, and human dignity mean something to you, then you're right where you belong. Hannah's heart thundered in her chest as Kent's firm grip guided her through the jeering crowd. The wooden boards of the platform creaked beneath her feet as she stepped down, clutching her small bundle of belongings close. She kept her eyes fixed on the snow-covered ground, unable to meet the shocked stares of the townsfolk who had moments ago been mocking her size and worth. The wind whistled sharp and cold between the buildings, catching at her plain dress and woolen shawl. Kent's massive form beside her blocked most of the bitter gusts. His broad shoulders squared against the weather like a living windbreak. His steps were sure and steady, crunching through the fresh powder as he led her toward the edge of town. Hannah dared a quick glance up at her unexpected savior. Kent Hale's face was set in stern lines, his jaw clenched beneath his thick beard. She had heard whispers about the mountain man who rarely came to town, except to trade furs and supplies, but she had never seen him up close before. His rough clothes carried the scent of wood smoke and pine, so different from the familiar smells of her father's farm. "Sir," she ventured quietly, her voice barely carrying over the wind. I don't know what to say." Kent's stride didn't falter. "Ain't nothing to say," he rumbled, his deep voice gentle despite its gruffness. "Couldn't leave you standing there like that. Weren't right." Tears pricked at Hannah's eyes, but she blinked them back. The memory of her father's harsh words still rang in her ears. "No man will ever want you. You're nothing but a burden." Yet here was this stranger, stepping forward when everyone else had turned away. They passed the last buildings of town, the snow growing deeper as they started up the ridge trail. Kent produced a lantern from his pack and lit it with practiced motions, the warm glow creating a small circle of light around them. The path wound upward through stands of dark pine trees, their branches heavy with snow. Hannah's legs began to ache from the climb, unused to such steep terrain. Her breath came in visible puffs in the cold air. Without a word, Kent slowed his pace to match hers, though she knew it must try his patience. "Not much further to the cabin," he said after a while, breaking the silence. "Got a good fire going before I came to town. We'll be warm when we get there." The simple kindness in his words made Hannah's throat tight. She hadn't felt warmth, real warmth, since the day her father had driven her from their home. The past weeks of searching for work, sleeping in barns when kind farmers allowed it, had left her cold down to her bones. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate for what she felt. "But what you said in town about sons." Her cheeks burned despite the cold. Kent's steps faltered slightly. In the lantern light, she saw a flush creep up his neck above his collar. "Weren't proper, maybe, speaking so bold," he admitted, "but had to say something to make them listen, to show I was serious." He paused, then added quietly, "Ain't expecting nothing from you, Miss Lapp. Just offering a safe place is all." The honesty in his voice loosened something tight in Hannah's chest. She nodded, clutching her bundle closer. They walked on in silence as the snow continued to fall, the flakes catching the lantern light like tiny stars. The trail grew steeper, switching back and forth up the ridgeline. Hannah's legs trembled with exhaustion, but she pressed on, determined not to show weakness. Kent remained beside her, his presence steady and reassuring in the gathering dusk. Finally, they crested a small plateau, and Hannah saw the cabin ahead. It was larger than she'd expected, built of solid logs with a stone chimney that sent up wisps of smoke into the darkening sky. A small barn stood to one side, and she could make out the shapes of a few chickens hurrying to their coop as night approached. Kent stepped forward to unlock the cabin door, holding it open for her. Warm air washed over Hannah as she stepped inside, carrying the scent of wood smoke and something else. Stew, she realized, simmering in a pot by the fire. The cabin's single room was neat and clean, if sparse. A bed with a handmade quilt stood in one corner, a table and chairs in another. Shelves lined the walls, holding tools and supplies. Everything had its place, speaking of a man who valued order. "You can have the bed," Kent said, setting the lantern on the table. "I'll sleep by the fire." Hannah turned to him, finding her voice. "I can't take your bed, Mr. Hale. You've already done too much." A ghost of a smile touched his lips beneath his beard. "Kent," he corrected gently, "and you'll take the bed. My ma raised me proper, even if some might doubt it." He moved to the fire, stirring the stew pot. "You must be hungry. Been a long day?" Hannah's stomach rumbled at the mention of food, and she blushed. Kent pretended not to notice, focusing on ladling stew into 2 bowls. He handed one to her, along with a spoon, then pulled out a chair at the table. "Sit," he said. "Eat while it's hot." Hannah sank into the chair, her legs grateful for the rest. The stew was simple but good, chunks of venison with potatoes and carrots. She couldn't remember the last time she'd had a proper meal, and she had to force herself to eat slowly, to maintain some dignity. Kent sat across from her, his own bowl seeming small in his large hands. He ate quietly, his eyes on his food, giving her space to eat in peace. The fire crackled in the hearth, and outside the wind whistled through the pines. When the bowls were empty, Kent rose to add wood to the fire. Hannah stood too, gathering the dishes. "Please, let me wash these. It's the least I can do." He looked like he might protest, but something in her face must have shown how much she needed to be useful. He nodded, showing her where he kept the washing supplies. As Hannah washed the bowls and spoons, she felt some of the day's tension begin to ease from her shoulders. The simple, familiar task helped ground her in this strange new place. Behind her, she heard Kent moving about, setting up his bedroll near the hearth. "There's water in the pitcher if you want to wash up," he said when she'd finished. "And?" He hesitated, then went to a trunk in the corner. He pulled out a clean shirt and pair of trousers. "For sleeping. They'll be too big, but better than your dress." Hannah took the offered clothes, touched by his thoughtfulness. "Thank you," she said softly. "For everything." Kent nodded, his eyes meeting hers briefly before looking away. "Get some rest, Miss Lapp." "Been a hard day." "Hannah," she said. "Please, just Hannah." A small smile touched his lips again. "Hannah?" he agreed. Then he turned to bank the fire for the night, giving her privacy to wash and change. The borrowed clothes were indeed enormous on her frame, but they were soft from washing and smelled of soap and pine. Hannah climbed into the bed, pulling the quilt up to her chin. She could hear Kent settling onto his bedroll, the floorboards creaking slightly under his weight. The fire's glow cast dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, snow continued to fall, but here, for the first time in weeks, Hannah felt safe. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was a prayer of thanks, for Kent's unexpected kindness, for warm food and shelter, for a chance at a new beginning. In the darkness, Kent listened to Hannah's breathing even out into sleep. He stared up at the cabin's shadowed rafters, thinking about the courage it had taken for her to trust him, a stranger. He had spoken true in town. He expected nothing from her. But something in her quiet dignity, in the way she had endured the townspeople's cruelty without breaking, had stirred his heart. The wind sang through the pines outside, and the fire crackled low in the hearth. Kent pulled his blanket closer, his own eyes growing heavy. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, they were both safe and warm, sheltered from the storm. The wind whistled through the pines as Kent and Hannah made their way up the snow-covered trail. Their boots crunched through knee-deep drifts, and Hannah's legs trembled with each step. The bundle in her arms felt heavier by the minute, but she pressed on, determined not to show weakness. Kent walked beside her, his massive frame breaking trail through the deepest snow. Every few minutes, he would pause, letting her catch her breath without drawing attention to her struggle. The lantern in his hand cast dancing shadows across the white landscape. "Almost there," he said softly, pointing ahead to where smoke curled against the darkening sky. "Just beyond that ridge." Hannah nodded, saving her breath for walking. The cold had settled deep in her bones, and exhaustion pulled at her like lead weights. But anything was better than the humiliation she'd endured in town, the jeering faces and cruel words still fresh in her mind. When they finally crested the ridge, Hannah saw the cabin, larger than she'd expected, built of solid logs with a stone chimney. A small barn stood to one side, and she could make out the shapes of chickens hurrying to their coop as night approached. Kent stepped forward to unlock the cabin door, holding it open for her. Warm air washed over Hannah as she stepped inside, carrying the scent of wood smoke and something else. Stew, she realized, simmering in a pot by the fire. The cabin's single room was neat and clean, if sparse. A ladder led to a small loft area where she glimpsed a bed. Below, a table and chairs stood near a window, and shelves lined the walls, holding tools and supplies. Everything had its place, speaking of a man who valued order. Kent moved to the fireplace, adding logs and stirring the coals until flames leapt up. Hannah stood awkwardly by the door, unsure what was expected of her. Her heart hammered in her chest as she waited for the crude demands she was certain would come. But Kent only moved to the stew pot, lifting the lid to check its contents. "Hungry?" he asked, glancing her way. "Made venison stew this morning, before heading to town." Hannah nodded hesitantly. Kent ladled stew into 2 wooden bowls, placed them on the table, then pulled out a chair for her. When she was seated, he surprised her by bowing his head. "Lord," he prayed quietly, "thank you for this food, and for bringing Hannah safe to shelter. Amen." The simple prayer brought unexpected tears to Hannah's eyes. She blinked them away quickly, focusing on the bowl before her. The stew was good, chunks of tender venison with potatoes and carrots, and fresh bread beside it. They ate in silence for a while, the fire crackling in the hearth. Hannah could feel Kent watching her, though he looked away whenever she glanced up. Finally, he cleared his throat. "What I said in town," he began, his voice rough with embarrassment. About sons. It weren't proper, speaking so bold." He set his spoon down, meeting her eyes directly for the first time. "Truth is, I ain't never been with a woman." Hannah stared at him, the confession so unexpected she nearly dropped her spoon. This mountain of a man, who had silenced the jeering crowd with his thunderous voice, was admitting to being as untouched as she was? Kent's face reddened, but he continued. "Been alone up here most my life. Ma died when I was young, never knew my pa. Learned to hunt, to survive, but—" He gestured at the cabin around them. "Ain't much to offer a wife. Still, I've prayed every day for God to send me someone to share it with." He looked down at his hands, massive and work-roughened. "When I saw you today, standing so brave despite their cruel words, I felt it in my heart. You were the answer to those prayers. Weren't lust that made me speak up, but faith." His voice dropped lower. "I'm hoping in time You might see your way to being family, but I ain't expecting nothing you don't freely give." Hannah's throat felt tight with emotion. She set her own spoon down, gathering courage to speak. "My father," she began softly. "He cast me out 3 weeks ago. Said no man would want a wife as big as me, that I was bringing shame on the family." The words hurt to speak, but Kent's quiet attention gave her strength to continue. "I've heard those words all my life. Too big, too much, not fit to marry. The bishop himself said I must have some secret sin to be shaped as I am." Tears slid down her cheeks now, but she didn't wipe them away. "I tried so hard to be smaller, to fast and pray, but nothing changed. Finally, Father said he wouldn't feed another useless mouth." She drew a shaky breath. "I've been walking from town to town since then, looking for work. But everywhere it's the same. Mockery or worse." Kent's hands clenched on the table, but his voice remained gentle. "Ain't right, treating any of God's children so." He hesitated, then added, "My ma was a big woman too. Strongest person I ever knew, could outwork any man in the valley, and had a laugh that made everyone smile." A shadow crossed his face. "Lost her to fever when I was 12. Been mighty lonely since then." Hannah found herself reaching across the table, touching his hand briefly. "I'm sorry about your mother." He nodded, a small smile touching his lips. "She'd have liked you. Always said the good Lord makes people in all shapes and sizes, and it's what's in their hearts that matters." The words soothed something deep in Hannah's soul, a balm to years of judgment and shame. Outside, a wolf's howl echoed through the darkness, answered by others in the distance. Hannah shivered slightly. "They won't come near the cabin," Kent assured her. "But it's getting late. The loft bed's yours. Fresh sheets up there and warm blankets. I'll sleep down here by the fire." Hannah started to protest, but Kent shook his head. "Ma raised me proper, even if some might doubt it. You take the bed." Too tired to argue, Hannah climbed the ladder to the loft. The bed was neatly made with a handmade quilt, and a screen provided privacy. She changed into the nightgown from her bundle, listening to Kent moving about below, banking the fire for the night. As she lay in the darkness, Hannah could hear Kent settling onto his pallet near the hearth. The fire's glow cast dancing shadows on the ceiling beams, and outside, the wolves called to each other across the snow-covered valleys. But for the first time in weeks, she felt safe. More than that, she felt the stirring of hope. Kent's words about faith and family had touched something in her heart she thought long dead. He sought not to use her body, but to build a life together. The realization brought fresh tears to her eyes, but these were tears of gratitude. Below, Kent stared up at the cabin's shadowed rafters, listening to Hannah's breathing even out into sleep. He thought about her courage in sharing her story, about the pain she'd endured. His mother would indeed have liked her, would have seen past the surface to the gentle strength within. The wind sang through the pines outside, and the fire crackled low in the hearth. Something new had begun this night, fragile as a spring seedling but full of promise. Kent pulled his blanket closer, his own eyes growing heavy. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, they were both where they needed to be. Safe, warm, and no longer alone. Morning light crept through the cabin's frosted window panes, casting pale squares across the rough-hewn floorboards. Hannah stirred in the loft bed, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar cedar scent and the distant tinkle of a brass bell. Then the rich aroma of boiling coffee reached her, and memories of the previous day flooded back. The auction block, Kent's thunderous voice, the long trek through snow to this mountain sanctuary. Below, she heard Kent moving quietly about the cabin, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. The coffee pot rattled against the iron stove, and she caught the soft sound of him humming. Not a tune she knew, but something slow and peaceful. Hannah dressed quickly behind the privacy screen, smoothing her plain dress and pinning her prayer covering in place. Her fingers lingered on the familiar fabric, remembering countless mornings in her father's house. But there was no use dwelling on what was lost. The Lord had led her here, to this strange new life, and she would face it with courage. The ladder creaked as she descended. Kent stood at the stove, his broad back turned to her as he poured coffee into 2 tin cups. He wore a faded blue shirt with a tear along one shoulder seam, and Hannah noticed several other places where the fabric had been inexpertly mended. "Morning," he said, turning to hand her a cup. His eyes were careful, like he was afraid any sudden movement might startle her. "Sleep well?" Hannah nodded, wrapping her hands around the warm tin. "Yes, thank you." She gestured to his shirt. "I could mend that for you, if you'd like. I'm good with a needle." A smile touched Kent's lips, softening his weathered face. "Much obliged. Been doing a poor job of it myself." He paused, sipping his coffee. "Thought I might show you around today. The barn, woodpile, where everything is. If you're willing?" "I'd like that," Hannah said, and meant it. The routine of household work would help settle her racing thoughts. After a breakfast of cornbread and honey, Kent led her outside. The morning air was crisp and clean, making Hannah's cheeks tingle. Fresh snow blanketed everything, but Kent had already cleared paths to the barn and woodpile. Their boots crunched along the packed snow as he showed her around. The barn was a solid structure, smaller than the one she'd known at home, but well-maintained. A gentle-eyed mule lifted its head from a hay rack, ears pricking forward with interest. "That's Bessie," Kent said, reaching out to scratch the animal's forehead. "Best mule in these mountains. Takes me hunting, helps haul wood." He glanced at Hannah. "She likes apples, if you've got one to spare." Hannah approached slowly, letting the mule catch her scent. Bessie's soft muzzle tickled her palm, making her laugh. The sound seemed to startle them both. Hannah couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed freely in front of anyone. Kent's eyes crinkled at the corners. "She likes you already. Smart animal, Bessie." They moved on to the woodpile, stacked neat and high against the barn wall. "Should last through winter," Kent said, "but I'll cut more come spring." He showed her the pump where he drew water, the root cellar dug into the hillside, the smokehouse where strips of venison hung drying. Back inside, Hannah found Kent's sewing kit, a tin box containing a handful of bent needles and tangled thread. She sat by the window while he hauled water for washing, her skilled fingers making quick work of his torn shirt. The familiar task soothed her, and she found herself humming softly as she worked. When Kent returned, he set about showing her where he kept the cream churn, the butter molds, the various tools of household work. Hannah listened carefully, noting how everything had its place, though many items showed signs of long neglect. The cream churn hadn't been used in months, Kent admitted, and the butter molds were dusty with disuse. "Would you like fresh butter?" Hannah asked, already rolling up her sleeves. At Kent's eager nod, she set to work, pouring cream into the churn while he built up the fire. The rhythm of the churn paddle was familiar, comforting. Hannah found herself telling Kent about learning to make butter at her mother's knee, about the songs they would sing to pass the time. She didn't realize she was crying until a tear splashed onto her hand. Kent said nothing, but he moved quietly around the cabin, giving her space to compose herself. When the butter finally formed, Hannah began to lift the heavy churn to pour off the buttermilk. Kent stepped forward to help, but his massive hands, so sure with an axe or saw, proved clumsy with the delicate task. Cream sloshed over the rim, spattering them both. Hannah gasped, then caught sight of Kent's dismayed expression as he tried to wipe up the spill with his huge palms, only making more of a mess. A giggle escaped her, then another, until she was laughing outright. After a moment, Kent's deep chuckle joined in. "Reckon I need more practice at that," he said, shaking his head as he fetched a cloth to clean up properly. "We'll work on it," Hannah replied, surprising herself with the easy way she assumed a future here. But Kent's smile told her he'd caught the words too, and welcomed them. They worked together through the afternoon, finding a natural rhythm. Hannah swept and scrubbed, while Kent split more wood and checked his trap lines. The cabin grew warm and clean, filled with the scent of fresh bread from the oven and coffee from the pot Kent kept hot on the stove. As dusk approached, Kent found her at the wash basin and cleared his throat. "Come outside a minute? Want to show you something?" Hannah dried her hands and followed him onto the porch. The setting sun painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold, more beautiful than anything she'd ever seen. Kent pointed to the distant ridges, their jagged profiles etched against the darkening sky. "That's all the family I've had. These mountains," he said quietly. "Been lonely sometimes, but they're always there, steady as God's promises." He glanced at her. "Thought maybe you might want to know them too." Hannah's heart swelled with emotion, gratitude for his gentleness, for the way he offered friendship instead of demands. Without thinking, she began to sing, her voice soft in the gathering darkness. It was an old Amish hymn, one her mother had taught her, about finding shelter in the Lord's care. Her voice trembled at first, years of being told to be quiet, to take up less space, making her uncertain. But the mountains seemed to catch the notes, carrying them up into the pristine air. Then Kent's deep voice joined in, tentative but true, harmonizing with her on the chorus. Hannah's eyes filled with tears, but she kept singing. For the first time in her life, she felt safe raising her voice beside a man, unafraid of mockery or rebuke. The hymn floated out over the snowy valley as the first stars appeared, a song of praise and thanksgiving. When the last note faded, they stood in comfortable silence, watching night settle over the mountains. The air grew sharper with cold, and Hannah shivered slightly. Without a word, Kent opened the cabin door, letting warmth and lamplight spill out onto the porch. Inside, the fire crackled welcome, and the familiar scents of bread and coffee wrapped around them like a quilt. Hannah moved to the stove to prepare their evening meal, while Kent lit the lamps and pulled off his boots. The simple domestic scene felt right, as if they'd been sharing this space for years instead of hours. The peaceful morning shattered with 3 sharp knocks at the cabin door. Hannah froze at the wash basin, her hands dripping soap suds. Kent rose from his chair by the fire, brow furrowed. They weren't expecting visitors, especially not with fresh snow on the ground. Kent opened the door to reveal a weather-beaten rider stamping his boots on the porch. Cold air rushed in, making the lamp flames dance. "Got a letter here," the man said, pulling a sealed envelope from his coat. "Come from way east, marked urgent." Hannah's heart clenched when she saw the familiar precise handwriting, her father's hand. The rider tipped his hat and departed, leaving them staring at the envelope as if it might bite. Kent turned it over in his large fingers before breaking the seal. "Would you rather read it private?" he asked softly. Hannah shook her head. "Please, read it aloud." Her voice quavered. She gripped the back of a chair to steady herself. Kent cleared his throat and began to read. To the attention of Hannah Lapp and the man claiming to be her husband. His deep voice grew tighter as he continued. The letter detailed how her father had petitioned the Amish elders, declaring her marriage shameful and demanding its immediate annulment. If she refused to return home, she would be forced into servitude to correct her wayward spirit. Hannah's hands trembled so badly she had to sit down. The words struck like physical blows. Shame, wayward, correction. She'd thought herself beyond her father's reach, but his judgment still had power to wound. Kent crossed the room in 2 strides and gripped her shoulder firmly. "They won't take you," he said, voice fierce with conviction. "You're my wife now. Nobody's forcing you anywhere." She looked up at him, seeing the determined set of his jaw. "But the elders—" "Ain't got no authority here in Colorado territory," Kent finished. "This is our home. You're safe here." He squeezed her shoulder once more before moving to pull on his heavy coat. "Need to ride into town for supplies anyway. Get some flour, nails for that loose board in the barn. While I'm there, I'll make sure folks know where we stand on this matter." Hannah watched him saddle Bessie through the window, her thoughts churning like storm clouds. The mule's hoofbeats faded into the distance, leaving her alone with her fears. To keep her hands busy, she mixed up bread dough, kneading it perhaps harder than necessary. The familiar motions helped calm her racing heart. The cabin seemed too quiet as she waited. She swept the floor twice, organized Kent's meager collection of tin plates, and sang every hymn she could remember. Still, her father's words echoed in her mind. Shame, wayward, wrong. The sun was setting when she finally heard Bessie's steady gait returning. Kent came in with arms full of supplies, flour, nails, salt, and other necessities. But his face was troubled as he set everything down. "What is it?" Hannah asked, dreading the answer. Kent sighed heavily, removing his snow-covered coat. "Heard some talk in town. Men at the mercantile." He hesitated, clearly not wanting to cause her pain. "They're taking bets on how long our marriage will last. Most say under a month." Hannah's hands clenched in her apron. Of course they would bet against them. The giant, awkward mountain man and the fat, cast-off Amish woman. What chance did they have? "Already got $3 wagered myself," Kent continued quietly. She looked up, startled. "You bet on us?" "On us lasting?" He nodded. "Figured might as well profit from their foolishness." A small smile touched his lips. "Put it on us making it a year. By then reckon they'll have found something else to gossip about." Hannah felt tears well up. Not of sorrow this time, but gratitude for this man's steady faith in them. She turned away to wipe her eyes, busying herself with setting out supper. They sat down to eat, steam rising from bowls of rabbit stew. Hannah's hand shook slightly as she reached for her spoon, the day's events weighing heavy. Before she could grasp it, Kent's large hand covered hers, warm and calloused. "We'll prove them wrong," he said simply. "All of them. Your father, the elders, those betting men in town. None of them know what God has planned for us." Hannah met his earnest gaze across the table, seeing the same quiet determination that had made him speak up at the auction. He hadn't wavered then, facing down a jeering crowd. He wasn't wavering now. "Thank you," she whispered, turning her hand to clasp his properly. "For standing firm." Kent squeezed her fingers gently. "Always will," he promised. They bowed their heads to pray, hands still linked, while outside the mountain wind sang through the pines and stars began to shine over the snowy peaks. The letter lay forgotten on the shelf, its threats powerless against the warm certainty growing between them. Whatever challenges came, they would face them together, the mountain man and his chosen bride, building something stronger than fear or shame could break. They ate their supper in comfortable silence, broken only by the crackling fire and the distant cry of a night bird. Hannah's thoughts drifted to the fresh flour Kent had brought. Tomorrow she would bake bread, fill their home with the scent of sustenance and care. One day at a time, they would prove the doubters wrong. Kent cleared the dishes after they finished, his big hands careful with the tin plates. "Thought maybe," he said hesitantly, "if you're willing, you might teach me that hymn you were singing earlier." "The one about shelter?" Hannah's heart swelled. "I'd like that," she replied, and began to sing softly, Kent's deep voice joining in as the evening deepened around their mountain home. Winter settled into a peaceful rhythm at the mountain cabin. Each morning, Hannah woke to find Kent had already stoked the fire and set coffee to boil. The routine brought comfort, like the steady ticking of her mother's old clock. One crisp morning, Kent appeared at breakfast holding 2 pairs of snowshoes, The wooden frames were weathered but sturdy, the rawhide webbing still tight. "Thought you might want to learn," he said, ducking his head shyly. "Make it easier to get around come deep snow." Hannah examined the strange contraptions with wonder. "I've never seen the like," she admitted, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "My ma taught me when I was knee-high," Kent explained. He helped her strap them on, his big hands gentle as he adjusted the bindings. "Just like walking, but you got to lift your feet more." Hannah took her first tentative steps in the fresh powder behind the cabin. She wobbled like a newborn colt, clutching Kent's arm for balance. "I feel foolish," she laughed, cheeks pink with cold and embarrassment. "You're doing fine," Kent assured her. "Better than my first try. Ended up face first in a snowbank." They practiced all morning, Kent showing her how to navigate the drifts. By noon, Hannah was gliding alongside him with growing confidence. The exercise left her breathless but proud. When they returned to the cabin, she insisted on teaching him something in return. "My mother's recipe for potato soup," she declared, pulling out her carefully preserved notebook. Simple but filling. Kent watched in fascination as she showed him how to layer the ingredients just so. His massive hands looked out of place holding the delicate potato peeler, but he followed her instructions with careful attention. When the soup was ready, steam rising from their bowls, Kent's eyes lit up at the first taste. "Better than anything I've managed in 15 years of bachelor cooking," he admitted. Days flowed one into another, each bringing new lessons shared between them. Hannah learned to split kindling without hurting herself. Kent discovered the proper way to knead bread dough. Their laughter came easier now, like spring water breaking through winter ice. One dawn, they woke to frantic squawking from the henhouse. Kent grabbed his rifle while Hannah snatched up a broom. They burst out into the pale morning light to find a red fox trying to break into the coop. "Get on, you thief!" Hannah shouted, swinging her broom while Kent circled around behind. The fox darted this way and that, searching for escape. When Kent lunged to grab it, the creature slipped between his legs. Hannah's broom caught its tail as it fled, sending up a spray of snow. They stood panting in the aftermath, looking at each other. Kent's hat had fallen off in the chase, and Hannah's hair had come loose from its pins. Suddenly, they both burst out laughing. The fearsome mountain man and his wife, armed with rifle and broom, routed by one small fox. "Reckon we showed him," Kent chuckled, retrieving his hat. "Indeed we did," Hannah agreed, still giggling as she checked on the nervous hens. All were present and accounted for, though thoroughly ruffled. The warmth of such moments sustained them when they ventured into town for supplies. There, the welcome was as cold as the winter wind. Women at the general store whispered behind their hands as Hannah selected fabric, their sneers cutting deep. "Heard she ate her way out of that Amish community." "Poor Kent Hale taking up with such a fat cast-off. Bet she breaks his bed the first night." Hannah kept her head high, though her hands trembled as she counted out coins for her purchases. Kent's steady presence beside her helped, but she could see how the cruel words wounded him too. His jaw would clench, hands fisting at his sides, though he never raised them against the mockers. One bitter afternoon, Hannah was leaving the general store alone, Kent having gone to the blacksmith, when she heard a child's cry. Near the hitching post, a small boy had collapsed in the snow. His mother knelt beside him, calling his name in panic. Hannah rushed over, laying a hand on the boy's forehead. "He's burning up," she said, recognizing the glazed look in his eyes. The same fever had taken her little sister years ago. "The doctor's 3 miles out," the mother sobbed. "I can't carry him that far." Without hesitation, Hannah handed the woman her packages. "I can." She scooped the boy onto her back, his slight weight settling against her broad shoulders. "Show me the way." They set out through the deepening snow, the mother leading on horseback. Hannah's legs burned with each step, but she thought of her sister and pressed on. The boy's breath came hot against her neck, his small hands clutching her shawl. The 3-mile journey felt endless. Twice Hannah stumbled, but each time she found her footing again. Her back ached, her lungs strained against the cold air, but she refused to stop. Finally, the doctor's cabin came into view, smoke rising from its chimney. Hannah managed the last few steps to the porch before her legs gave out. She went to her knees, careful to keep the boy from hitting the ground. The mother's cries brought the doctor running. As he lifted the child from Hannah's back, darkness crept into the edges of her vision. She was vaguely aware of hoofbeats approaching, of Kent's voice calling her name. Strong arms gathered her up, cradling her against a broad chest. She breathed in the familiar scent of wood smoke and leather. "I got you," Kent murmured, holding her close. "I got you, brave woman." Through half-closed eyes, Hannah saw a crowd had gathered. The same townspeople who had mocked her size now watched in silence, as Kent carried her inside the doctor's cabin. She heard their whispers change tone. "Did you see? Carried that boy 3 miles. Never would have made it otherwise? Maybe we judged too quick." The doctor's wife brought her hot tea and blankets while they waited for news of the boy. Kent never left her side, his large hand engulfing hers. When the doctor emerged to announce the crisis had passed, they'd caught the fever in time. Relieved tears slipped down Hannah's cheeks. "You saved my son's life," the mother whispered, embracing Hannah. "I'll never forget what you did today." Kent helped Hannah stand, supporting her weight. "Let's get you home," he said softly. But as they made their way to where Bessie waited, townspeople stepped forward to offer help. A warm shawl, a flask of broth, promises to check on them tomorrow. Hannah leaned against Kent's solid strength, exhausted but at peace. The mockery that had seemed so important that morning now felt as insubstantial as snow in sunshine. She had found something better, the knowledge that she was strong enough to help others, worthy enough to be helped in return. Kent lifted her carefully onto Bessie's back, then mounted behind her. As they rode home through the gathering dusk, Hannah felt his arms secure around her waist, keeping her safe and warm. The mountain wind sang through the pines, carrying away the last echoes of shame and bringing instead the sweet sound of respect earned, of community slowly opening its heart. The late March sun worked steadily at the snowdrifts, turning the mountain paths into ribbons of mud and slush. Hannah stood before their cabin's clouded mirror, pinning her hair beneath her Sunday bonnet. Her fingers trembled slightly as she smoothed her dress, her best one, carefully altered to fit her fuller figure. "You look fine," Kent said from the doorway, adjusting his own string tie. His usually wild beard had been trimmed, and he'd managed to tame his hair with water and a comb. Hannah gave him a small smile. "First time at service together. I just want to." She trailed off, unable to voice her worry about the townspeople's reaction. "The Lord sees your heart," Kent reminded her gently. "That's what matters." They set out early, Kent leading their mule Bessie through the melting snow. The morning air held a hint of spring, and tiny green buds dotted the aspen branches. Hannah hummed an old Amish hymn as they walked, her voice growing stronger with each step. The little white church sat on the edge of town, its fresh paint gleaming in the morning light. As they approached, Hannah could see other families arriving, women in their best bonnets, men in pressed shirts, children scrubbed pink for the occasion. The chatter died down as Kent helped her from Bessie's back. Whispers followed them up the wooden steps. "Bold as brass, them too." Never thought Kent Hale would darken a church door. "That dress surely strains at the seams." Kent's hand tightened on Hannah's arm, but before either could react, Reverend Matthews stepped forward. His weathered face creased in a genuine smile. "Welcome, welcome," he called out, extending both hands to them. "Brother Kent, Sister Hannah, we're blessed to have you join us today." The preacher's warm greeting seemed to thaw some of the ice. A few women nodded hesitantly as Hannah passed, and one young mother shifted her children to make room in the pew. Kent helped Hannah settle, then took his place beside her, his broad shoulders filling the space. The service began with Amazing Grace, and Hannah's clear voice rose above the congregation. She knew every verse by heart, and when Kent joined in with his deep bass, several heads turned in surprise. The mountain man's usual silence made his rich singing voice unexpected. Reverend Matthews's sermon spoke of new beginnings, of winter giving way to spring, of God's grace making all things new. Hannah felt the words sink deep into her soul, soothing old wounds. Kent's hand found hers during the final prayer, and she squeezed it gratefully. After the service, several townspeople approached with cautious greetings. The young mother from their pew introduced herself as Sarah Miller, thanking Hannah again for saving her nephew during the fever. Another woman complimented Hannah's singing voice, and a gruff old rancher clapped Kent on the shoulder. "Good to see you here, Hale," the rancher said. "About time you joined civilization." Kent managed a small smile. "Reckon my wife's civilizing influence is showing." Hannah's heart warmed at his words, but the moment was broken by the sound of raucous laughter from the saloon across the street. Several men had gathered there, ignoring the Sabbath. Kent's expression darkened. "Wait here with Sarah," he murmured to Hannah. "I need to see about something." Before she could protest, he strode toward the saloon. Hannah tried to focus on Sarah's friendly chatter about spring gardens, but her eyes kept straying to the swinging doors Kent had disappeared behind. Inside the smoky saloon, Kent moved quietly to the bar, ordering a glass of water. The bartender raised an eyebrow but served him without comment. From his position, Kent could clearly hear the conversation at a corner table. "Railroad's pushing hard for that northern route," one man was saying. "Agent's been throwing money around like water." "That Brant fellow?" another asked. "Slick as a greased pig, that one. Heard he's been making deals all up and down the territory." "Speaking of deals," a third voice cut in. "You hear about the one he struck with that Amish elder? Lapp, I think the name was. Something about his daughter." Kent's hands tightened on his glass as he listened. "Yeah, promised to marry the girl himself, sight unseen. Paid good money too, from what I heard. Then the old man up and banished her instead. Something about her being unmarriageable. Brant's been raising hell about it ever since." "That the same girl Kent Hale took in? The big one?" Laughter rippled around the table. "One and the same. Brant's still claiming his right to her. Says he paid fair and square, contracts binding. Good luck getting past Hale. Man's built like a grizzly and twice as mean when riled." Kent had heard enough. He set his untouched water down and slipped out, his mind churning with this new information. The bright afternoon sun seemed harsh after the saloon's dimness, but Hannah's worried face brought him quickly back to the present. "Kent? What's wrong?" He shook his head slightly, not wanting to discuss it in the street. They said their goodbyes to the lingering churchgoers and started the long walk home. Kent unusually quiet, even for him. It wasn't until they were safely inside their cabin, with a fresh pot of coffee brewing on the stove, that Kent finally spoke. "There's something you need to know," he began, watching Hannah's face carefully. "I overheard some men talking about a railroad agent named Brant." Hannah's hands stilled in the act of setting out cups. "Silas Brant? You know him?" She sank into a chair, her face pale. "I heard his name before, in whispers between my father and the other elders. There was talk of a contract, but I never knew." Kent knelt beside her chair, taking her trembling hands in his. "Hannah, did your father promise you to this man? Before the banishment?" A tear slipped down Hannah's cheek. "I remember hearing raised voices one night. Brant was angry, saying he'd paid good money and expected his due. Father said I was too fat, too unmarriageable, that no one would want me. That he'd return the money if Brant would just go away." Her voice broke. "The next day, he cast me out." Kent's jaw clenched, but his touch remained gentle as he wiped away her tears. "Listen to me. No man has the right to trade you like cattle, not even your father. You're my wife now, and I swear before God I'll protect you." Hannah looked into his earnest face, seeing the strength and tenderness there. What if Brant tries to enforce the contract? Then he'll learn that some things can't be bought or sold. Kent's voice was quiet but firm. Your heart, your choice, those belong to you alone. Hannah slipped from her chair to kneel beside him on the rough wooden floor. "And I choose you," she whispered, "not because of any contract or command, but because you saw me, really saw me, when everyone else looked away." Kent gathered her close, his big hands careful and sure. "Then we'll face this together, with God's help." They stayed like that for a long moment, the late afternoon sun painting golden stripes across the cabin floor. Finally, Hannah pulled back slightly. "We should pray," she said softly, "for strength, for guidance." "For protection," Kent added, "from those who would tear us apart." Together they bowed their heads, their clasped hands resting on the seat of the chair Hannah had vacated. The familiar words of the Lord's Prayer mixed with their own heartfelt petitions, rising with the wood smoke toward heaven. Outside, a spring bird called hopefully through the gathering dusk, while inside, two hearts beat as one in faith and determination. The mountain air grew softer as winter's grip loosened. Patches of bare earth emerged from beneath the melting snow, dark and rich with promise. Kent stood at the edge of his small field, studying the ground with careful eyes. The sun warmed his broad shoulders as he drove his spade deep into the soil, turning it over in neat rows. Hannah watched from the cabin doorway, her arms full of seedling trays. The sprouts she had nurtured through the last cold weeks were finally ready for their new homes in the warming earth. She marveled at how different everything looked without winter's white blanket. The cabin seemed smaller against the vast mountainside, yet somehow more like home than ever before. "Ground's ready," Kent called, wiping his brow. "Reckon these potatoes ought to take well here." Hannah set down her precious cargo and joined him in the freshly turned field. Together they worked in comfortable silence, Kent creating deep furrows while Hannah followed behind, carefully placing seed potatoes at measured intervals. The morning passed quickly, marked only by the sun's arc and the occasional rest to drink from their water jug. "My father would say we're planting too early," Hannah remarked, patting soil over another potato. "But something tells me you know this mountain's moods better than any calendar." Kent nodded, a slight smile touching his lips. "Been watching these slopes for 15 years now. Snow's gone for good this time. Feel it in my bones." Their shared labor had become a dance of sorts, each anticipating the other's movements. When Hannah stumbled over a hidden root, Kent's steady hand caught her elbow before she could fall. When he needed more seed potatoes, she was already heading toward their dwindling pile. The ease between them had grown like a tender shoot, pushing through initial awkwardness to find the sun. As afternoon shadows lengthened, they finished the last row. Hannah straightened, pressing her hands against her lower back. "That's the last of them," she said, satisfaction clear in her voice. Kent surveyed their work with pride. "Good day's labor," he agreed. "Now for your green things." They moved to the smaller plot near the cabin, where Hannah had already prepared the soil for her more delicate plants. Here the work was slower, more precise. Kent's huge hands looked almost comical holding the tiny sprouts, but his touch was surprisingly gentle as he helped transfer them from their trays. "Like this?" he asked, carefully settling a tomato seedling into its new home. Hannah nodded, demonstrating how to cup the soil around the fragile stem. "Just so. You've got a good touch for it." His ears reddened at the praise, but his smile deepened. Had a good teacher. The spring evening stretched long and golden around them. When the last plant was settled in its place, they sat together on the cabin's rough-hewn porch steps, watching the sun paint the western peaks in shades of rose and amber. The day's work had left them pleasantly tired, content in their shared accomplishment. Hannah began to hum softly, one of her old Amish hymns that had become as familiar to Kent as his own heartbeat. The melody spoke of God's faithfulness through changing seasons, of hope renewed like spring grass after winter snow. Without conscious thought, Kent found himself joining in, his deep voice harmonizing with her clear tones. The song swelled fuller than before, their voices carrying across the small clearing. Hannah's eyes widened slightly. It was the first time Kent had sung out so boldly with her. Usually his participation was more hesitant, almost shy. But tonight, something had shifted, like winter ice giving way to spring melt. As the last notes faded into the gathering dusk, they shared a look that made words unnecessary. Love shone plain as day on their faces, honest as the earth they had worked together. Hannah's cheeks flushed pink, but she didn't look away. Kent's hand found hers, work-roughened fingers intertwining. The next day brought news of a frontier revival meeting, set to begin that evening in the meadow just outside town. "Reckon we ought to go," Kent said over breakfast. "Show folks we're not hiding up here." Hannah agreed, though her stomach fluttered with nerves. Large gatherings still made her uneasy, too many memories of mockery and shame. But Kent's steady presence beside her had begun to heal those old wounds, one day at a time. They arrived as the sun was setting, joining the crowd gathering around the makeshift platform. Lanterns hung from poles cast dancing light across familiar and strange faces alike. Hannah recognized some townspeople who had begun to greet her warmly since the day she had carried the sick child to the doctor. Others were clearly travelers, drawn by word of the revival. Kent found them seats near the middle of the congregation, close enough to hear, but not so near as to draw attention. Hannah settled beside him, drawing comfort from his solid warmth. The evening air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke, mixed with the sweet perfume of early spring flowers. The preacher was a tall, thin man with fire in his eyes and thunder in his voice. He spoke of redemption, of God's power to make all things new. His words rolled across the meadow like summer storm clouds, drawing amens and hallelujahs from the crowd. "Who here has a testimony?" he called out after his sermon. "Who will stand and declare what the Lord has done?" Several people rose to share their stories, tales of healing, of salvation, of lives transformed. Hannah felt Kent stir beside her, and then to her surprise, he was on his feet. Her heart caught in her throat as he cleared it to speak. "I lived alone on that mountain for 15 years, Kent's voice carried clearly, though public speaking clearly made him uncomfortable. "Thought that was all I'd ever need. Me and God and the wild places?" He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But the Lord had other plans. He sent me Hannah." The crowd grew still, all eyes turning toward them. Hannah felt the weight of their attention, but Kent's next words drove everything else from her mind. "Some folks wondered why I spoke up that day at the auction. Truth is, I saw something in her eyes, same loneliness I'd carried so long. God gave me Hannah, and I'll never let her go. She's made my house a home, my life complete. That's my testimony, how the Lord can take two broken paths and make them one straight road to glory." Applause broke out, scattered at first, then swelling like a wave. Hannah felt tears spilling down her cheeks as she leaned against Kent's arm, her heart too full for words. Around them, faces that had once held scorn now showed approval, even joy. The preacher's voice rose above the clapping. "Praise God! Now that's a testimony of true love." Kent sat back down, his own eyes suspiciously bright. Hannah kept her head against his arm, not caring who saw her tears. In that moment, surrounded by the gathering darkness and flickering lantern light, she felt truly accepted, not just by Kent or the town, but by God himself. The meeting continued with more songs and prayers, but Hannah barely heard them. Her mind kept returning to Kent's words, to the public declaration of their love that had somehow transformed their private happiness into something bigger, something blessed by both God and community. As they walked home later, beneath a sky strewn with stars, Hannah finally found her voice. "Thank you," she whispered, "for saying what you did." Kent squeezed her hand. "Only said what was true," he replied simply. "Figured it was time everyone else knew it, too." They continued up the mountain trail, their lantern light bobbing like a earthbound star. Behind them, the last hymns of the revival floated on the night air, a benediction for their journey home. The revival's warmth lingered like sunset against mountain peaks. Lanterns still glowed in the meadow as folks gathered around rough wooden tables laden with pies and coffee. The night air carried sweetness, both from the desserts and from the newfound acceptance warming Hannah's heart. "Must say, your apple pie puts mine to shame," Mrs. Peterson admitted, cutting another slice. The shopkeeper's wife, who had once turned away from Hannah, now smiled genuine welcome. "Would you share your secret?" Hannah ducked her head, pleased. "Just a pinch of nutmeg in the crust," she offered. My mother taught me that." The word caught in her throat, memories of home briefly shadowing her joy. Kent stood nearby, deep in conversation with the blacksmith about spring planting. His bass voice carried clearly, confidence growing with each word. Hannah watched him gesture as he spoke, marveling at how the once solitary mountain man now moved easily among neighbors. Someone started a hymn, and others joined in. Hannah found herself sharing her worn hymn book with Sarah, the miller's daughter who had once whispered cruel names. Now their voices blended in harmony, singing of grace and redemption. Kent's hand found hers as they sang, warm and sure. "Reckon we should head up before it gets too late," Kent finally said, noting how the moon had climbed high above the peaks. Hannah nodded, gathering her empty pie plate. The walk home was filled with quiet contentment, their boots crunching on the path while whip-poor wills called from the timber. Morning brought change swift as mountain weather. Hannah was hanging fresh-washed sheets, humming yesterday's hymns when she heard it, thundering hoofbeats approaching from the valley road. Her hands froze on the damp cotton as dust rose beyond the trees. "Kent!" she called, fear tightening her throat. He emerged from the barn, axe in hand, just as the riders burst into view. Hannah's heart stopped. There at the head of the group rode Elder Stoltzfus, his black beard and severe hat marking him as Amish leadership. Behind him came two more elders she recognized from home. But it was the fourth rider who made her blood run cold. Silas Brandt, the railroad agent, his fancy suit dusty from hard riding. "Kent," she whispered again, backing toward him as the riders dismounted. His hand found her shoulder, steadying. "Stay behind me," he murmured, setting down his axe. "We'll handle this proper-like." The group strode toward them, boots heavy on packed earth. Elder Stoltzfus spoke first, his German accent thick with authority. "Hannah Lapp, you will return with us now. This false marriage must end." Kent stepped forward, keeping Hannah sheltered behind his broad frame. "Sir, with respect, Hannah's my wife proper. We were married by—" "Silence," Stoltzfus thundered. "She was promised elsewhere. You have no claim." Silas Brandt stepped forward, brushing trail dust from his sleeve. "Indeed, I have here a contract, signed by Jacob Lapp himself. The girl comes with me, part of our railroad routing agreement through Amish lands." His smile was cold as winter wind. "Can't have verbal agreements breaking written contracts now, can we?" Hannah felt sick. Her father had truly sold her, treating her like cattle to be traded. She gripped Kent's shirt, drawing strength from his solid presence. "We're going to town," Elder Stoltzfus declared. "This will be settled before proper authorities." The group herded Kent and Hannah toward their horses. Hannah's legs shook as they walked, Kent's arms steady around her shoulders. The ride into town was tense. dust coating their clothes as the horses picked their way down the mountain trail. The town meeting house was already filling as word spread of the confrontation. Hannah recognized faces from last night's revival, now drawn with concern. The elders and Brant marched them inside, where the sheriff and preacher waited. "Now then," Brant began smoothly, producing papers from his coat. "As you can see, this contract clearly states—" "I don't care about your paper," Kent interrupted, voice hard as mountain granite. "Hannah's my wife before God and man. No contract can break that." "You dare question our authority?" Elder Stoltzfus advanced on Kent, face flushed with rage. "This girl belongs under proper Amish guidance, not with some godless mountain man." "I ain't godless," Kent's voice rose, "and Hannah ain't property to be sold." The tension snapped. One of the younger elders swung his rifle like a club, catching Kent across the shoulders. He staggered but didn't fall. Another blow landed on his back. Still, he stood his ground. "Hannah!" he shouted as more blows rained down. "Hannah, I won't let them!" The rifle butt caught him in the face. Blood sprayed as he crashed to his knees. Hannah screamed, trying to reach him, but strong hands grabbed her arms. She fought wildly as Brant and an elder dragged her toward the door. "Kent! Kent!" Her voice broke on sobs as they lifted her into a waiting wagon. Through tears, she saw him struggling to rise from the muddy street, blood streaming down his face. "Hannah." His voice was thick, desperate. "Hannah, I'll find you." The wagon lurched forward. Hannah caught one last glimpse of Kent, on his knees in the mud, lips moving in prayer even as blood dripped from his chin. Then they were galloping east, hooves thundering like her heartbeat. The elders rode hard, clearly planning to put as much distance as possible between Hannah and the mountains before nightfall. She huddled in the wagon bed, tears drying on her cheeks as the familiar peaks receded behind them. Every jolt of the wheels carried her further from Kent, from the home they'd built together. The last thing she heard as they crested the ridge was Kent's voice, carried faint on the wind. "Hannah!" Then there was only the rumble of wheels, the crack of whips, and the sound of her own ragged breathing as the wagon rolled on into gathering darkness. Candlelight flickered against rough-hewn walls as Kent's eyes fluttered open. Pain shot through his body, each breath a reminder of the beating. Clean bandages wrapped his ribs tight, and the familiar scent of the preacher's wife's herb poultice filled his nostrils. "Where's Hannah?" The words came out rough, his throat dry as creek sand in August. Preacher Thompson looked up from his Bible, concern etched deep in the lines around his eyes. "Easy now, son. You took quite a beating." "Where is she?" Kent tried to sit up, grimacing as his muscles protested. "They took her east," the preacher said softly, setting aside his book. "Toward the railroad junction at Cedar Creek. The elders aim to put her on a train back to Pennsylvania, I reckon." Kent's massive hands gripped the quilt, knuckles white with determination. "How long was I out?" "Most of yesterday and through the night. Martha tended your wounds best she could." The preacher's wife appeared in the doorway, carrying a steaming cup of willow bark tea. "Much obliged, ma'am," Kent managed, accepting the cup with trembling fingers. "But I can't stay abed. Need to catch up to them before they reach the railroad." "You're in no condition to ride," Martha protested, her motherly concern evident. "Those men broke 2 of your ribs, and your face is swollen something fierce." Kent touched his jaw gingerly, feeling the crusted blood and puffy flesh. "Don't matter none. Hannah needs me." The preacher exchanged a knowing look with his wife. "At least let us feed you proper before you go. Martha's got fresh biscuits in the oven." Dawn painted the mountains gold as Kent led his mule from the preacher's barn. His body screamed with every movement, but determination drove him forward. Martha had packed him a bundle of food and fresh bandages, while the preacher contributed a worn Bible and words of prayer. As Kent checked his saddle straps, a shadow detached itself from the tree line. His hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, before recognizing the familiar figure of Henry Red Elk, the Cherokee scout who sometimes guided army patrols through the territory. "Brother," Henry greeted him softly, leading his own paint pony forward. "I heard what happened in town." Kent nodded, grateful for the man's quiet presence. Henry was known for his tracking skills and knowledge of the eastern trails. More importantly, Kent trusted him. They'd shared campfires and stories over the years. "They took my wife," Kent said simply, the words catching in his throat. Henry's dark eyes held understanding. "I know these trails better than most. The wagon will leave signs, broken branches, pressed grass, wheel ruts. If you'll have my help, I'll ride with you." Relief washed through Kent like spring thaw. "Much obliged, Henry. Truly." They mounted up as the first rays of sun touched the valley. Kent's ribs protested each step of his mule, but he set his jaw against the pain. The preacher and his wife stood on their porch, watching the two men ride east. "The wagon had a loose wheel," Henry observed, studying the trail. "See how the rut runs deeper on the right? Makes them easier to follow?" Kent nodded, grateful for his friend's expertise. They rode steadily through the morning, Henry pointing out signs most men would miss: disturbed pebbles in creek beds, broken twigs on low branches, places where the wagon had scraped bark from trees on tight turns. By midday, dark clouds gathered overhead. They stopped briefly to let the animals drink from a clear stream, Kent using the moment to stretch his aching muscles. The willow bark tea had dulled the worst pain, but every breath remained a reminder of his injuries. "They're pushing hard," Henry commented, studying the trail. "Driving the horses too fast for this terrain. They'll have to rest them soon, or risk losing one." "Good," Kent growled. "Means we'll gain ground." They ate dried beef and hardtack in the saddle, not wanting to waste precious daylight. The afternoon brought rain, fat drops that dampened their clothes and turned the trail muddy. Still they pressed on, Henry's keen eyes never losing the wagon's track. As dusk approached, they made camp in a sheltered grove. Kent gathered firewood while Henry tended the horses, each man moving with the efficient rhythm of long experience in the wilderness. The scout produced coffee and corn cakes from his saddlebags, sharing them without comment. After they'd eaten, Kent pulled out the preacher's Bible. Its pages fell open to the Song of Solomon, and his throat tightened as he read silently. "Many waters cannot quench love, neither can floods drown it." "Tell me about her," Henry said quietly, adding wood to their small fire. Kent looked up, firelight reflecting in his eyes. "Hannah. She's different from any woman I've known. Strong in spirit, though life's been hard on her. Sings like an angel when she thinks no one's listening." He paused, remembering. "First time I saw her, standing in that town square while folks mocked her size, something in me just knew. Knew God meant her for me." Henry nodded, understanding in his dark eyes. "Among my people, we say the Creator put certain souls together like he pairs eagle and sky, meant to be one." "Reckon that's truth," Kent agreed softly. "Just wish I'd protected her better." "You stood against many men," Henry reminded him. "Took their blows without yielding. That's warrior's courage." They fell silent, watching sparks rise toward stars now peeking through breaking clouds. Kent's body ached fiercely, but his resolve grew stronger with each mile covered. Somewhere ahead, Hannah was being carried away from their mountain home. He would find her if he had to track her clear to Pennsylvania. Before sleeping, Kent knelt painfully by his bedroll. "Lord," he prayed aloud, voice rough with emotion, "watch over Hannah tonight. Keep her safe till I can reach her." He paused, adding softly, "Hannah, I'm coming for you, beloved." Henry pretended not to notice the tears that slid down his friend's bruised face, respecting the private moment. Instead, he added more wood to the fire and began humming a quiet Cherokee melody, a song of faithfulness and return. The night deepened around them, filled with cricket song and distant coyote calls. Kent finally slept, his massive frame curled beside the fire, one hand still gripping the Bible. Henry took first watch, his keen eyes scanning the darkness while his friends' whispered prayers echoed in his heart. Tomorrow would bring more miles, more tracking, more pain. But with each hoofbeat, they drew closer to Hannah. Kent's love and determination would accept nothing less than finding her, no matter the cost to his body or the distance yet to cover. In his sleep, Kent murmured Hannah's name again, the sound carrying on the night wind like a promise. Hannah's teeth rattled as the wagon lurched over another rut in the muddy trail. Her wrists chafed against the rough rope binding them, hidden beneath layers of scratchy wool shawls. The early spring rain had started as a drizzle, but now fell in steady sheets, drumming against the wagon's canvas cover. Beside her, railroad agent Silas Brandt lounged on the wooden bench, seemingly unbothered by the jolting ride. His immaculate suit looked out of place against the wagon's rustic interior. Every few miles, he would turn to her with that same smug smile that made her stomach clench. Quite the improvement from that mountain savage's cabin, wouldn't you say? Brandt's voice dripped with false concern. Once we reach Cedar Creek, you'll ride the train in proper style. Your father has arranged everything. Hannah kept her eyes fixed on her lap, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a response. Instead, she moved her lips in silent prayer, drawing strength from the familiar words of psalms and hymns she had sung with Kent. The memory of his deep voice joining hers brought tears to her eyes, but she blinked them away before Brandt could notice. The wagon creaked to a stop as dusk approached. Hannah heard the Amish elders discussing the need to rest the horses and wait out the worst of the rain. Her heart quickened. Perhaps this delay would give Kent time to catch up. She knew in her bones he would come for her, no matter his injuries. "Out you go!" Brandt commanded, grabbing her arm roughly. "Can't have you getting too comfortable." Hannah stumbled as he pulled her from the wagon, her feet sinking into cold mud. The elders had already started a fire under a crude lean-to, the flames dancing despite the drizzle. A cast-iron skillet sat near the coals, waiting for their evening meal. Her eyes fixed on that skillet, measuring its weight, its distance from where they made her sit. Years of cooking had taught her how to handle heavy iron cookware. She tucked that knowledge away, like a secret weapon. One of the younger elders brought her a tin cup of water, avoiding her eyes. These were men who had known her since childhood, who had watched her grow up in their tight-knit community. Now they treated her like a stranger. Worse, like property to be traded. "Careful now," Brandt called out with a laugh. "Don't want to overtax those floorboards with her considerable weight." The elders shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Hannah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but not from shame this time. Anger sparked deep in her chest, feeding a flame of rebellion she had never known she possessed. As night fell, the rain intensified. Thunder rolled across the hills, reminding Hannah of Kent's deep voice. She watched through lowered lashes as Brandt paced near the fire, his polished boots now caked with mud. His facade of civilization was cracking with each hour spent in the wilderness. "Your mountain man won't find us in this weather," he said, catching her watching him. "Probably still lying in the dirt where we left him. Should have known better than to steal what belonged to me by right of contract." Hannah's fingers curled into fists beneath the shawls. "I belong to no man by contract," she said quietly, her first words since their departure. "I chose Kent freely before God." Brandt's face darkened. He strode over and seized her chin, forcing her to look up at him. "You're nothing but damaged goods, girl. Too fat for any proper man to want. Your father was glad to be rid of you, sold you to me for a pittance and some railroad shares." Lightning flashed, illuminating the hatred in his eyes. Hannah met his gaze steadily, remembering how Kent had looked at her with such tenderness, such respect. The contrast gave her courage. "The Lord sees what you do," she whispered. "Even in darkness." Brandt released her with a curse, wiping his hand on his jacket as if touching her had soiled him. He stomped away to speak with the elders, leaving Hannah alone by the fire. She inched closer to the flames, seeking warmth. The skillet still sat there, handle pointing toward her like an invitation. Hannah began humming softly, an old Amish hymn about deliverance, about God's protection in times of trial. "Be silent!" Brant snapped from across the fire. "No one wants to hear your caterwauling." But Hannah continued humming, a quiet act of defiance. The familiar melody steadied her nerves as she watched the skillet through the corner of her eye. She thought of Kent teaching her to snowshoe, his patient strength as she learned to balance. She thought of their evenings singing together, of his calloused hand holding hers during prayer. The rain fell harder, driving the elders to seek shelter in the wagon. Only Brant remained by the fire, his fine clothes now thoroughly soaked. He paced like a caged animal, cursing the weather and the mud and the delay. Hannah lifted her face to the rain, letting it wash away her tears. "Lord," she prayed silently, "give me strength. Show me when to act. Help me be brave like Kent." Thunder answered her prayer, rolling across the hills like drums of war. Hannah felt something shift inside her, the last traces of the meek, shame-filled girl she had been falling away. In her place rose a woman who knew her own worth, who had tasted love and freedom in a mountain cabin with a gentle giant of a man. She watched Brant through the curtain of rain, noting how his shoulders slumped with fatigue. The skillet waited, its iron surface gleaming in the firelight. Hannah's hands flexed beneath the shawls, testing the gyve in her bonds. She had spent a lifetime being told she was too big, too heavy, too much, but perhaps God had made her strong for just such a moment as this. "Lord," she whispered into the storm, "give me strength." The prayer settled in her heart like a promise, like the weight of Kent's hand on her shoulder. Hannah waited, watching, gathering her courage as the rain fell steadily around them. She was no longer the rejected daughter or the ridiculed woman. She was Kent's chosen wife, and she would fight for their love with every ounce of strength God had given her. The skillet caught another glint of firelight, and Hannah felt her resolve harden like iron in a forge. She might be bound, but she was not beaten. Not while breath remained in her body and hope lived in her heart. Through the darkness and rain, she imagined she could hear hoofbeats approaching. Whether real or wishful thinking, the sound gave her courage. Hannah straightened her spine, eyes fixed on the skillet as she waited for her moment to act. The storm raged on, but within her heart, a different kind of thunder was building. Thunder cracked across the darkened sky as Kent Hale leaned forward in his saddle, pressing his mule through the deepening mud. Every jolt sent waves of pain through his bruised ribs, but he gritted his teeth against the discomfort. Behind him, Henry Red Elk guided his paint horse with practiced ease, scanning the rain-soaked ground for signs. "Tracks lead east," Henry called out over the storm's growl, but rain washing them away fast. Kent nodded grimly, wiping water from his eyes. They'd been riding since dawn, stopping only when necessary to rest the animals and check the trail. His wounds screamed for rest, but the thought of Hannah in the hands of that railroad man drove him forward like a spur in his flesh. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the crude path ahead. The wagon tracks they'd been following disappeared into a swollen creek, its waters turned angry and brown by the storm. Kent pulled his mule to a halt at the water's edge, heart sinking as he watched the current sweep past. "Could have crossed anywhere along here," he said, voice rough with exhaustion and worry. "Or gotten swept downstream." Henry dismounted smoothly, crouching to study the muddy bank. His fingers traced marks in the earth that Kent's untrained eyes could barely see. "Wait here," he said, straightening. "I will scout downstream. Creek may have forced them to make camp." Kent watched as his friend led his horse along the creek's edge, moving like a shadow through the rain. The Cherokee scout had proven invaluable over the past days of pursuit, reading signs Kent would have missed entirely. Without Henry's help, he might have lost the trail completely. Alone in the storm, Kent pressed a hand to his side, feeling the crude bandages beneath his shirt. The beating he'd taken still painted his body in shades of purple and yellow, but physical pain seemed distant compared to the ache in his heart. He thought of Hannah's face as they dragged her away, the terror in her eyes as she'd screamed his name. "Lord," he prayed aloud, voice nearly lost in the thunder, "protect her till I get there. Give me strength to bring her home." Minutes stretched like hours as Kent waited, rain drumming steadily on his hat brim. His mule shifted restlessly, sensing his tension. Finally, Henry materialized from the gloom, moving quickly despite the treacherous footing. "Found them," he reported in a low voice. "Quarter-mile downstream. Made camp under some cottonwoods. 4, maybe 5 men besides the woman." Hope surged through Kent's chest, chasing away some of the bone-deep weariness. "Hannah? Is she—" "She lives," Henry assured him. "Saw her by their fire. Bound, but not hurt that I could see." Kent's hands tightened on his reins. "Show me." They left the animals secured in a stand of pine trees, continuing on foot through the rainy darkness. Kent carried his rifle, though the wet conditions made it nearly useless. Still, its familiar weight brought comfort as they crept through mud and underbrush. Henry led them on a circuitous route, avoiding the obvious approach to the camp. Soon, Kent could see the glow of a fire through the trees. They belly-crawled the final yards to the edge of the firelight, taking shelter behind a fallen log. The scene before them made Kent's blood boil. Hannah sat huddled beneath some blankets near the fire, her hands bound before her. The railroad agent, Brant, Kent remembered with hatred, paced nearby, cursing the weather. 3 Amish elders huddled in their wagon, while a 4th kept watch, looking miserable in the rain. Lightning flashed again, and Kent saw Hannah's face clearly for a moment. His heart clenched at her expression, not defeated as he'd feared, but alert and watchful. She was studying something near the fire with careful attention. "Need distraction," Henry whispered beside him. "Draw guards away. Then you can reach her." Kent nodded, trying to ignore the stabbing pain in his ribs as he shifted position. "What kind of distraction?" "Leave that to me," Henry replied with a slight smile. "When you hear owl call, be ready. But wait for second call before moving." Before Kent could respond, the Cherokee melted away into the darkness. Minutes ticked by, marked only by thunder and the steady drum of rain. Kent kept his eyes fixed on Hannah, willing her to sense his presence somehow. As if hearing his silent prayer, Hannah's head lifted slightly. Another flash of lightning illuminated the camp, and Kent saw her eyes widen as she caught his silhouette in the shadows. She made no obvious reaction, but he saw her shoulders straighten, her chin lifting with renewed determination. A haunting owl call drifted through the rain, so natural-sounding that even Kent might have been fooled if he hadn't been waiting for it. The guard by the wagon turned toward the sound, rifle ready. "Just an owl," Brant said dismissively, but his voice held an edge of nerves. The call came again, this time from the opposite direction, then another, and another, until it seemed they were surrounded by unseen owls. The guard shifted uneasily, peering into the darkness. "Check it out," Brant ordered sharply. "Could be Indians." The guard slogged reluctantly into the darkness, followed by 2 of the elders. Brant drew a pistol, turning in slow circles as the owl calls continued their eerie chorus. Kent tensed, ready to move. He saw Hannah's hands shift beneath her blankets, her eyes fixed on something just beyond the firelight. Following her gaze, he spotted a cast-iron skillet lying near the flames. A final owl call pierced the night, closer than the others. Brant spun toward the sound, his back to the fire. In that instant, Hannah lunged forward, seizing the skillet in her bound hands. Before the railroad man could turn, she swung with all her might, catching him squarely in the back of the head. Brant crumpled without a sound. Kent was already moving, splashing through mud toward the fire. Hannah spun at his approach, skillet raised again, then dropped it with a sob of recognition. "Kent," she breathed as he reached her, his knife already sawing at her bonds. "I knew you'd come." "Always," he promised hoarsely, gathering her close as the ropes fell away. Her familiar solidity in his arms made his heart soar, despite the rain and pain and danger. A shout from the darkness reminded them they weren't safe yet. Kent grabbed Hannah's hand, turning toward their escape route, only to find their way blocked by the returning guard, his rifle leveled at Kent's chest. But before the man could fire, a shadow detached itself from the night behind him. Henry brought the stock of his own rifle down in a precise blow, and the guard joined Brant in unconsciousness. "Time to go," the Cherokee said calmly, as if he hadn't just saved their lives. They splashed through the rain toward their waiting mounts, Kent supporting Hannah as she stumbled in the mud. Behind them, confused shouts echoed as the remaining elders discovered their unconscious companions. "Can you ride?" Kent asked Hannah as they reached the animals. She nodded firmly. "With you, I can do anything." Despite their dire situation, Kent felt his heart warm at her words. He helped her mount behind him, feeling her strong arms wrap around his waist. Henry was already in his saddle, gesturing toward a game trail leading away from the creek. Thunder rolled overhead as they urged their mounts forward, mud flying from iron-shod hooves. Hannah pressed her face against Kent's back, holding tight as they rode through the storm. Her presence gave him strength, helping him ignore his protesting ribs and focus on escape. "Thank you," Hannah whispered against his shoulder, voice barely audible above the rain and thunder. "For coming after me. For believing in me." Kent reached down to squeeze her hand where it rested against his stomach. No words seemed adequate to express the depth of his feelings, so he simply held her fingers tight, letting actions speak what his tongue could not. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the path ahead as they rode through the storm-dark forest. Though danger still lurked behind them, Kent felt his heart soar with triumph and gratitude. Hannah was safe in his arms again, where she belonged. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Dawn crept over the eastern horizon, painting the storm clouds in shades of gray and purple. Rain still fell steadily, drumming against the muddy ground around the campfire. The railroad agent, Silas Brant, paced near the dying flames, his boots squelching with each step. His patience had worn thin through the long, wet night. "Get up!" he barked at Hannah, who sat hunched beneath her sodden blankets. "We're moving out before this weather gets worse." Hannah's fingers tightened around the cast-iron skillet she had kept hidden beneath the covers. Hours of gripping the heavy handle had left her hands cramped, but she didn't dare let go. She had waited through the darkness, watching, listening, knowing Kent was near. Now, as pale light filtered through the trees, she prepared herself. Brant reached down to grab her arm. Hannah saw her moment. With strength born of years hauling water and working farmland, she swung the skillet upward in a fierce arc, the heavy iron connected with a sickening thud. Brant's eyes went wide with shock before rolling back in his head. He crumpled to the ground, his fancy suit splashing in the mud. "She's loose!" one of the elders shouted, scrambling for his rifle. Before anyone could react, Kent burst from the tree line like an avalanche. His massive frame seemed to fill the entire clearing as he charged forward, rifle swinging like a club. The nearest elder went down hard, face first into the mud. Kent's fists found another, sending the man sprawling. Through the chaos, Henry Red Elk materialized like a shadow. His knife flashed in the dim light as he cut Hannah's bonds. "Go," he urged quietly, helping her to her feet. "I will cover your escape." But Hannah didn't run. Instead, she raised the skillet again as one of the remaining elders rushed toward them. The iron rang like a bell as it connected with his shoulder, sending him stumbling sideways into a tree trunk. Henry's eyebrows rose slightly, an expression of approval crossing his weathered features. Kent had engaged the last elder in a brutal struggle near the wagon. Despite his injured ribs, he fought like a grizzly bear, all raw power and unstoppable force. The elder, a stout man used to farm work, managed to land several solid blows. But Kent's righteous fury couldn't be denied. A final swing of his rifle butt ended the fight. Silence fell over the clearing, broken only by the steady patter of rain and the groans of fallen men. Hannah stood trembling, skillet still raised, scanning for more threats. Then Kent turned toward her, his face a mass of bruises and relief. "Hannah," he breathed, taking a step forward. The skillet slipped from her numb fingers, landing with a dull thud in the mud. Her legs gave way as the terror and tension of the past days crashed over her like a wave. But before she could fall, Kent's strong arms wrapped around her, pulling her close against his chest. Hannah buried her face in his wet shirt, breathing in his familiar scent of pine and leather. Great, racking sobs shook her body as she clung to him. All the fear, all the uncertainty, all the desperate loneliness poured out in a flood of tears. "I found you," Kent whispered into her hair, his own voice rough with emotion. "I found you, Hannah. You're safe now." She felt the tremors running through his massive frame, knew he was as overwhelmed as she was. His grip tightened, as if afraid she might disappear if he loosened his hold even slightly. Hannah pressed closer, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "I knew you would come," she managed between sobs. "I never doubted." "Always," he promised hoarsely. "Wherever you are, I'll find you. Whatever it takes." Henry appeared beside them, leading their horses through the rain. "We should go," he advised quietly. "More men may come when these fail to arrive at the station." Kent nodded, though he seemed reluctant to release Hannah even for a moment. Finally, he loosened his grip enough to look down at her tear-stained face. His rough thumb gently wiped away the wetness on her cheeks. "Can you ride?" he asked softly. Hannah straightened her shoulders, drawing on some deep well of strength. "Yes," she replied firmly. "Take me home." Kent helped her mount his horse, then swung up behind her despite his obvious pain. Hannah leaned back against his chest, feeling his heart beating strong and steady. His arms bracketed her as he took up the reins, surrounding her with warmth despite their soaked clothing. Henry had already mounted his own horse, scanning the woods with keen eyes. At his nod, they urged their mounts forward, leaving the unconscious men sprawled around the ruined camp. The rain would wash away their tracks, making pursuit difficult even if anyone tried to follow. They rode in silence through the gray dawn, the horses picking their way carefully over the muddy ground. Hannah felt exhaustion tugging at her, but she fought to stay awake. She focused on the rhythm of Kent's breathing, the gentle sway of the horse beneath them, the steady drum of rain on leaves overhead. "Rest," Kent murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "I've got you." Hannah allowed herself to relax fully against him, trusting in his strength to keep her safe. Her eyes drifted closed as the motion of the horse rocked her. The last thing she felt before sleep claimed her was Kent, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. The storm gradually began to clear as they rode westward toward home. Rays of sunlight pierced the clouds, making the raindrops glitter like diamonds on every branch and leaf. Birds began to sing, welcoming the new day. The world seemed somehow fresher, cleaner, as if the rain had washed away more than just physical dirt. Kent held Hannah close as they traveled, marveling at how right she felt in his arms. Every now and then, she would stir slightly in her sleep, and he would murmur quiet reassurances until she settled again. His ribs ached fiercely, and exhaustion pulled at his bones, but none of that mattered. Hannah was safe. They were together. Everything else was secondary. Henry rode slightly ahead, reading signs only he could see in the wet earth and broken branches. He led them along hidden trails and secret paths, gradually working their way back toward familiar territory. Occasionally he would glance back, a slight smile touching his lips at the sight of the two people he had helped reunite. The morning wore on as they traveled, the sun climbing higher in the clearing sky. Hannah slept on, wrapped in Kent's protective embrace, while their horses carried them steadily homeward through the rain-washed wilderness. The meeting house buzzed with tension as townsfolk packed the wooden pews. Sunlight streamed through high windows, catching dust motes in golden beams. Hannah and Kent stood before the altar, their fingers intertwined, facing down the stern-faced elders and Hannah's scowling father. "This marriage has no standing," one elder declared, his voice sharp. "It was not properly sanctioned." The preacher stepped forward, weathered statute book in hand. "I must disagree," he said firmly. His fingers traced down a printed page. "By Colorado territory law, their public declaration and shared life constitute a legal marriage bond." Near the back door, Railroad Agent Brandt's face flushed dark red. Without a word, he turned and slipped away into the morning light. Hannah's father opened his mouth, then closed it, his authority crumbling before the law and the assembled crowd. "I saw her carry my boy through the snow," a woman called out. "She's proven herself a true neighbor." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the congregation. The preacher raised his hands. "Let all acknowledge what God and law have joined together." Back at their cabin, the lamplight cast a warm golden glow across rough-hewn walls. Hannah stood at the wooden table, her strong hands working fresh dough with practiced motions. The familiar scent of yeast filled the air as she shaped the loaf. Kent knelt before the stone fireplace, carefully arranging logs to keep the flames steady through the night. Their supper was simple fare, venison stew and fresh milk, but contentment settled over them like a warm blanket. After the meal, Kent knelt beside Hannah's chair, his large hand trembling slightly as he placed it over her belly. His voice was thick with emotion. "Whether sons or daughters, whether none at all, you're the family I prayed for." Tears spilled down Hannah's cheeks as she pulled him close, holding tight to the man who had chosen her, defended her, and loved her completely. Outside their window, snow drifted silently across the darkened mountains. Inside their cabin, faith and love had built something stronger than shame or gossip, a true home at last. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.